Thank you, Chris. We are now coming to the last speaker of the morning section, and to reconfirm the high standard of speakers and panelists, we started in the morning with Professor Berlingeri and with Paolo D'Amico as President of the Italian Shipowner Association, and now we have the President of the European Shipowners Association. He's with us, Alphonse Guinier, and he will speak to us about what the European Union does with regard to piracy.
Thank you. Good morning to all of you. I'm not the President, but the Secretary General of the European Shipowners Association. The President is Juan Riva of Suardias. Having said that, we represent European shipowners in Brussels. That's what we're all doing, not going to the detail. One comment on what was said this morning. Somebody said, one of the speakers, that decision-making on legislation, such as the Insurance Directive, is made hastily. This is not correct for the Insurance Directive. As said this morning by David Baker, it took from 2005 to 2008, and even prior to publication of the first draft, there were a lot of discussions. So hastily discussions in Brussels, I wouldn't agree with that. Now, going to piracy, the EU, and what is the EU? The EU are, of course, the member states of the European Union. But next to that, you have the European Commission as an institution, and you have the European Parliament. Now, the experience has proven that the European Union has a unique position to act on piracy, and they did. They can act with development aid. They have a political power. They are involved in trade discussions, quite important as well, military involvement, etc. So we have always asked the EU to take even the leadership in the UN on action on piracy. But let's start with military. In September 2008, we had in our office in Brussels a lot of military people, unseen before, all those grades and uniforms and what have you. And there the basis was created to establish EU NAVFOR and the Atalanta mission. EU NAVFOR now established and operating from Northwood, north of London. Of course, there are still coordination meetings with governments in Brussels of the military delegates to the European Union. Main task of Atalanta EU NAVFOR was to escort vessels with food aid of the World Food Programme, but they also took action and protected risk ships, low freeboard tankers and what have you. The operation is from the air and from the sea. Of course, there is a cooperation with other navies around, NATO, US, Korea, Japan, China, and the mandate, we have been working on that very hard, of EU NAVFOR Atalanta, the military mission, has been extended to the end of 2014, and even the scope has been extended so that they can act from the ship or from the air on the land, not go on the land. Quite important. They did so because they took action on the Somali coast. Now, we have told constantly EU NAVFOR that their terms of engagement should be extended, that they should work for vulnerable vessels. I mentioned tankers and free larboard ships, but also that member states should contribute with ships to EU NAVFOR. They are limited, the resources they have, maximum 9 ships, sometimes 6, few planes, so it's quite poor. That's where the participation, the commitment of member states is so important. Now, let's leave the military action a bit aside and go to capacity building. Rather important if we talk of Somalia in the first instance. Now, the EEAS, European External Action Service, which is the service headed by Lady Ashton, Vice President of the Commission as well. They concentrated in practice, not in theory, on 3 actions: short-term, medium-term, and long-term. And the start was with judicial international cooperation, funding and cooperating with UN agencies to establish a legal system for pirates in Somalia and in the surrounding countries, not only Somalia. This is essential because today it's still to a large extent a limbo. Give you one example, there was a Belgian military vessel who was able to take 6 pirates. They could keep one, brought him to trial in Belgium, took meanwhile place, but the others they had to release because there was no legal reason to keep him, because the only one that had been involved in attacking a Belgian flagship is the one they took to court in Brussels. So the others were released. This means that indeed it is essential that a judicial system is built up, and that costs money, of course, in Somalia and in the surrounding countries. What they are also involved in is money laundering. Find those who finance, where does the money go to in the end? And this is quite important because if I listened to the previous speaker talking about the discussions in the task force on ransoms, our position is clear, supported by the unions, by the European Parliament and by the Commission. We cannot accept a ban on ransoms. We cannot do this because then the lives of our seafarers will of course be endangered. Medium-term action by the EEAS, and that is pure capacity building in practical terms. Building up, first of all, regional capacities, maritime capacities. And this is quite practical. For instance, establishing a coast guard, not only in Somalia, but also in the surrounding countries. Recently, a few small petrol ships coming out of Europe, not used anymore in Europe, were shipped to Somalia to use them over there. Not only give them to the Somali people or the Tanzanians or the Kenyan or the Kenyans, but also to train them in Coast Guard activities, which today are still very poor in the area. This is a very practical thing. Now, important is also that the EU is concentrating together with the countries in the area on fighting illegal fishing. Some of you will remember that some of the pirates, when it started, accused other countries to take all their fish away, illegal fishing, so that the local fishermen had no other possibility to stay alive, to feed their children, than to go into piracy. Therefore, the EU is indeed taking action against illegal fishing together with the surrounding countries. Let's go to the long-term actions, and that is, of course, political. I mentioned the different tasks which the EU could take care of. Development aid and political is quite important, as well as humanitarian aid. Now, indeed, the EES is assisting the present, and I'm weighing the word, Somalian government to create law and order as you have in other countries. Not easy, but it is happening, and the political dialogue is going on together, of course, with the UN. This is clearly a long-term action. In development aid, the EU is the biggest donor of all states in the world to Somalia. Best management practices were mentioned by Chris just a few minutes ago. They are indeed quite important. We are at version 4. Version 5 is worked upon. When we talk to EU NAFOR, we learn that the vast majority of European ship owners is applying best management practices. The bad news is that some others are still not doing it, and rather a majority. And if you have captured ships by pirates, that often best management practices are not applied. But regretfully, best management practices is not good enough today. There's a typo here, but don't look at it. Private armed guards are also necessary. And it was discussed in detail by Chris, so I won't go into it. I only want to underline two specific points. Flag states were mentioned as necessary to allow private armed guards on board. If I look at two examples that I know, in the Netherlands and in Belgium, that legislation is not yet there. In the Netherlands, they are working on it, but it may take a long time because there is no political agreement. In Belgium, it will be coming by the end of the year, they told us. Nevertheless, both in the Netherlands and in Belgium, ships have been flagged out to other flags because they couldn't take private armed guards on board. So flagging out because of the flag state, in this case Belgium and the Netherlands, not allowing private armed guards on board. So it is essential that governments, and I think Italy is almost there, allow the use of private armed guards, of course subject to the conditions which were outlined by Chris a few minutes ago. The second point I want to stress is that whereas we are talking about asking member states to allow private armed guards on board, we are working on certification and so on, that private armed guards should not become the norm. They should not become the norm because it is not the task of a ship owner to arm his ship and to defend the safety of the ship and of the crew. The other point which I want to mention quickly is we are always looking at Somalia, Indian Ocean, now the extension to Nigeria, a different kind of pirates, as mentioned before, because they are mainly after the cargoes, it was mentioned. But in Nigeria and West Africa, it's also more aggressive, more violent. So it is a different kind of pilotage that we meet there. And we are working with the European institutions to organize meetings with the governments over there, in particularly Nigeria, to get agreements from them to have assistance rather than, I don't use the word, cooperation to fight the pirates over there. But of course, there are a lot of other countries in the world where piracy takes place, and there again, the UN has an important role to play because we have UNCLOS, which is a UN piece of legislation, and the UN member states, forget the EU for a moment, should realize that they have to act on this so that piracy as such should not become a norm. We know it's not there to go away, but it shouldn't absolutely become a norm, not become a norm. Now, to conclude, a few points which I highlighted and which I wanted to repeat at the end, and that is, first of all, what I just mentioned, that the international community should indeed have this issue, this problem, high on their agenda and act on it. And as I said, we have asked the EU to take the lead here. The second point which I mentioned, and I repeat it here, that private armed guards should not become the norm. Another important point which I want to repeat is that we definitely have to say no to banning of ransoms. And the last point is that I would like to stress, especially as far as Somalia West Africa and the surrounding countries are concerned, that capacity building as such is a key element in attacking piracy all over, in addition to the military and other actions. Thank you.
So, thank you, Mr. Guinier. And now, basically, we are now at the point of our esteemed panelists. We know that some of them are already booked up for their comments or for questions. And then, of course, there will be space for questions from anybody else. The first of the panelists was asked to comment on the issue of piracy, just to follow up on what we were saying, is Mr. Giuseppe D'Amato. Is here, and we all know he went through the terrible experience of having a vessel hijacked, and so he will certainly have something interesting to say to us.
Scusatemi se parlo in italiano, il mio inglese non è molto accettabile. Comunque io desidero parlare soprattutto agli italiani. Per prima cosa ringrazio molto Francesco per avermi dato l'onore di sedere a fianco al maestro, al professore Berlinceri. Un applauso. E poi desidero parlarvi di quello che è successo a me e a mio fratello Luigi, perché noi abbiamo avuto il 50% delle navi italiane sequestrate, fra noi e mio fratello Luigi. Noi abbiamo avuto la Rosalia e purtroppo voi sapete che per quanto riguarda gli armati stranieri esiste già da 2 anni una legge che lo consente, però non è stato ancora approvato il regolamento. Per cui quando mettiamo degli armati stranieri a bordo, noi purtroppo siamo fuori legge. Sappiamo che la cosa viene tollerata, ma immaginate un magistrato che invece non la vuole tollerare. Noi siamo immediatamente indagati e possiamo andare addirittura in galera. E non solo per questo, perché noi non possiamo neanche coprire quelli che sono i rischi del sequestro, perché il riscatto in Italia è vietato praticamente e quindi noi non possiamo nemmeno fare questo legalmente. Quindi anche per questo potremmo essere indagati e passare veramente dei guai. Ora, questo regolamento, come ripeto, per quanto riguarda gli armati, è allo studio già da 2 anni e non si capisce perché non debba venire ancora approvato, perché effettivamente, credetemi, è un'angoscia per noi. Noi purtroppo siamo costretti ad andare in quelle zone continuamente e credetemi, quando so che stanno in prossimità dell'azione dei pirati, io non riesco a dormire la notte. È una cosa veramente terribile. E poi non vi posso descrivere quella che è stata l'angoscia dei 7 mesi che abbiamo avuto per la Rosalia. Perché noi, in effetti, quando purtroppo si passa un guaio, ma si ha da fare con persone ragionevoli, si ragiona, anche se si perde, ma lì si ha a che fare con persone che oggi dicono una cosa e domani dicono esattamente il contrario. Purtroppo, oltre al fatto che noi non possiamo legalmente coprire i rischi di questi sequestri, pensate tutti i danni che si hanno. Noi con la Rosalia siamo stati 7 mesi, mio fratello con l'Enrica è stato 11 mesi. E immaginate, per esempio, noi abbiamo avuto i generatori che vanno al nafta leggera, a diesel. Finito il diesel, ci hanno costretto i pirati a tenere ugualmente i generatori in moto perché vogliono tenere la nave illuminata di sera, di notte. Immaginate che cosa abbiamo trovato poi quando la nave è stata liberata per questi generatori, abbiamo dovuto cambiarli totalmente praticamente. E immaginate il danno che si riceve. Per quanto riguarda invece mio fratello, che è stato 11 mesi con una cisterna con petrolio a bordo, questo petrolio praticamente si è indurito E per scaricarlo hanno impiegato mesi e mesi con dei solventi speciali, quindi potete immaginare i danni che si ricevono e noi non potremmo neanche coprirli questi danni. Immaginate se non ci fosse questa copertura, una cosa del genere manda senz'altro all'elemosina dell'armatore. Quindi bisogna fare qualcosa. Io mi rivolgo specialmente agli avvocati. La Confidarme già sta facendo molto, perché so che il nostro Presidente continuamente lavora perché si risolve sia il problema degli animali sia il problema della copertura assicurativa. Però i nostri avvocati anche si rendessero pure loro partecipi di questa situazione, perché effettivamente è intollerabile. Io penso che anche voi vi rendiate conto che sono situazioni, e noi purtroppo continuamente dobbiamo andare lì e continuamente siamo angosciati dal problema che si può verificare. Vi devo dire anche un'altra cosa, e poi traete voi le conseguenze. Quando ci sono gli armati stranieri a bordo non succede niente. Ditemi voi che cosa significa questo. Grazie.
Non credo di riuscire a risolvere i problemi che sono stati esposti, ma siccome ha parlato di avvocati, noi non possiamo certo usare la forza, però possiamo porci due questioni: giurisdizione e legge regolatrice. Qual è la giurisdizione competente e quale è la legge regolatrice? Lei ha detto che il riscatto è vietato per legge, ma qual è la legge regolatrice quando una nave in alto mare è catturata dai pirati? Cosa si può fare? E penso che l'unica cosa che i giuristi possono fare è cercare di cooperare per vedere di risolvere queste due questioni, giurisdizione e legge regolatrice. Grazie.
Allora, direi per terminare now let's try to close on the piracy. Is there anybody else, panelist or anybody else in the public who has questions or comments on piracy? Umberto D'Amato, please.